Hello, Morocco, and it's nice to be there. My name is Bruce Watson, and I am here in my home in Massachusetts, right near ITD, Institute for Training and Development, and I'm going to be talking to you today and then later about social movements, both in America and in Morocco, and I want to talk about how movements work, how they don't work, how they succeed, how they fail, etc. First, let me say, just introduce myself, what a pleasure it is to be in Morocco because I have always wanted to go. And I came this close to going to Morocco. Let me tell you how close I was. Way back when, about 50 years ago, I was traveling with some friends in Spain, and I met them in Spain and in southern Spain on the Costa del Sol. And some of them wanted to go to Morocco. I bet you can guess why back in the 1970s. And they did, and when I got there, they'd already gone. And I met another friend who had come back from Morocco to meet me. And the other two guys were still there, and we didn't know where they were. And in those days, as you might have heard, that was it. You didn't know where they were. There was no way to know where they might be. We waited in Torremolinos in Spain for 2 weeks for these guys to show up, and they never did. And it could have been, who knows what could have happened. On a Friday night, we decided, well, we don't know where they are. We've got to go to Morocco to get them. So we got all set. I was thrilled, finally getting to go. We were all set to go. We were packed. And in come these two guys on a Friday night with these great stories of Morocco and everything. And that's how close I came. We didn't go. We turned around and went up into Europe, and that was that. But about 4 years later, still wanting to go to Morocco, I was back in Europe and traveling around, and I decided I'm going to Morocco. I'm going to ride a bicycle to Morocco. I was in southern France, and I bought a beautiful, fast 10-speed bike, a Gitane, and I rode over the Pyrenees, not the pyramids, over the Pyrenees and into Spain and headed for Morocco. Well, it was August, and I bet you can figure out the rest. My bike had 7 flat tires. I got burnt out going across central Spain in August, 95 degrees. And I made it to Madrid, and I decided Morocco will have to wait. And I turned around and went back up to the coast and back to England, and I have still never been to Morocco. At the moment, my wife and I have acquired enough frequent flyer miles to go anywhere in the world, any place in the world. Morocco is high on our list. We were choosing countries last January, thinking, where will we go? I guess you know the rest of that story. So it is still possible that someday I will get to your lovely country. I still find it fascinating. I've read novels and histories and things like that, and I will get there. And when I do, I hope you'll to find you somewhere. But for now, we'll have to do with this. So, moving on, let's talk about social movements. How I got into the study of social movements. Well, first of all, when I was a teenager, it was the 1960s in America and a major time for social movements. I was a little too young for most of them. Too young for the civil rights movement, but I watched it carefully on television and elsewhere. A little too young for the anti-Vietnam movement, although toward the end of it, in 1970, 71, I was in college, and I did go to some marches and other events, and then it sort of all faded out, as you might know about our history. But I never forgot how interesting movements were, and I decided later when I started writing that they were some of the most interesting things to write about. So I wrote this book. Let me see where I am here. It's backwards, I'm sorry, but it's called Bread and Roses. It's about the labor movement in America, a particularly famous strike called the Bread and Roses Strike, and 1912. And then I wrote this book, which is called, again, I apologize for the lettering, you might know these two men, Sacco and Vanzetti. 12 years after Freedom Summer, these men were arrested for murder in Massachusetts that they did not commit, and it became the biggest movement, the biggest social movement in world history. On the day of their impending execution, there were protests in Paris, in Rome, in London, Tokyo, Johannesburg, around the world. So that was a major movement. And finally, I wrote this book. I finally got to join the civil rights movement. I don't know if you can read that, but that one is called Freedom Summer. It's about a 1964 civil rights event in which 700 American students, college students, went to Mississippi, the hardest and harshest of the southern states back then, and worked with black people and worked with to get them registered to vote and to help them with their lives. And it became a major turning point in the civil rights movement. And so working on these three books introduced me to the idea that movements have a lot in common. They have a lot in common in how they succeed, and unfortunately, they have a lot in common in how they fail. We will be talking about, since I hope most of you are involved in movements in Morocco, we will be talking about what you might be able to do to help your movement move forward, what you try to avoid to help your movement crash, keep your movement from crashing, and that's, I will offer some tips. First, I just have a couple of, on this short segment, just a couple of things that movements do right and some of the things that they do wrong. First of all, one of the things that a movement needs to succeed, and by the way, these are very controversial. I found out after I started studying movements and teaching college classes in movements that I was nowhere near the first, of course, and this has been studied by sociologists and psychologists and historians as well on various theories on why movements succeed and fail. So these are mine. They aren't unique to, this isn't the only way movements can succeed and fail, and they're very controversial, but I'll offer you my tips. First of all, a movement needs a very clear message and a consistent message. If you think about Occupy Wall Street, it had in America, about almost 10 years ago now, a great message, a simple message. We are the 99%. We are the 99%. You are the 1%. So it clearly divides us versus them. And we'll talk when we meet in the full session with you on screen about that being one of the tactics of a movement. Polarization, set it apart, us versus them, and a clear message that everybody can know very easily. Black Lives Matter seems to be a clear message. It seems now to have been corrupted a little bit. People go, well, all lives matter. They just don't get it. So I thought Black Lives Matter, what could be simpler than that? But some people, you can't make it simple enough for some people. A clear message, a consistent message. Next, although this is something that new movements are trying to avoid, but I think, as my old-fashionedness, I think that movements need a very clear leadership, a very clear group or large group of people who are in charge. Helps if they've been elected, as we'll talk about later, but Martin Luther King was never elected. No one ever voted for him. You cannot expect your movement to have a Martin Luther King. People like that are rare. It's nice if you can get that. But in the meantime, have a clear set of leaders who can agree on things so you don't have what I think has hurt Black Lives Matter. Everybody's a leader. Has certainly hurt Occupy Wall Street. Everybody's a leader. We don't need no leaders. We got everybody can, it leads to some problems. Next, a movement needs a real grievance, something that is widely perceived and evident. Usually this is not a problem. Usually there's so many grievances that it's hard to focus. But one or two clear movement points that you can focus on and target and say, this is what we want to change. Occupy Wall Street never really came up with that. They said they were going to have one clear demand. They never got it. They never really decided. And then they even went so far as to say, well, here's our long list. This is our one demand. It didn't work. It didn't work. And after a while, it just fell apart. And finally, of course, a movement needs persistence, a long-term strategy, and people who are willing to stay in it for the long haul. If you have all of those, I think you're on your way. Although, as we'll talk about it, there are many obstacles. Now, quickly, let's move on to what movements can do wrong. Please watch this video. This is from a recent interview with leaders of Black Lives Matter.
How do you respond to that particular critique? Again, a loving critique from an elder of the struggle that some others share, that I've even shared as well, to be frank, is a concern about in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
Now, it looks like they've committed one of the sins of a movement. They have lost control of their message. I am not a Marxist. I think that there are good and bad things in Marxism, but if you want to get a red flag in the United States of America, if you want to put a big target on your movement, just call yourself a Marxist. It doesn't matter if these two people are the only Marxists in Black Lives Matter, and they might be. It doesn't matter if the movement has nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter how you and your movement perceive it. You call yourself Marxist, you're in the crosshairs. And as you see here, this has been repeated by President Trump and everybody else, and it's just a disaster for Black Lives Matter. The support for it, which was once much higher, has been dropping. Even though the movement is fully engaged, even though it keeps moving forward, this has been the target for the people. And a lot of people who supported the movement said, Marxist? I thought it was about police and Marxists. So they lost control of the message. They may get it back, but for now they've lost control of the message, and that's one of the worst things you can do. The anti-Vietnam movement really lost control of the message when many of the more radical elements came along. So it wasn't just end the war, it was change society, etc. And that was outside movement. Movements can suffer from muddled or changing leadership. You need to change your leaders every now and then, but if nobody knows who's in charge, if they're not sure who says, if one person says one thing, one says another, that can hurt a movement, as it did the civil rights movement. A movement can be bought out by the opposition. You can actually understand this happened in Morocco with some of the Arab Spring, that the king actually made some changes, said, okay, we got this. And even though they didn't, even though the changes were not at all what people were demanding, for a lot of people that seemed to be enough. And I understand, although you know more about it than I do, that weakened the movement. And finally, in the most common flaw of any movement that leads to its discrediting with the mainstream is violence. And even if it is provoked, as I think some of the violence in Black Lives Matter protests have been, certainly many of the labor movements were undone by provocateurs coming into the strikes and causing violence. Even if that happens, when people see violence in a movement, they say, no, we're not down for this. So you need to make sure that you control it very well. Now, let's look real quickly at two different movements, just some of the, as contrast, we have Occupy Wall Street and we have Arab Spring. We'll talk a little bit about what they did right and what they did wrong. We will also talk about what is a movement. How do you distinguish a movement from a trend? There might be, for example, some years ago, there was a thing called Coney 2012. It came on in a big wave. It had 10, 15 million hits on YouTube. It went around the world and it crashed because it really wasn't, as it turned out, a movement. There were a lot of flaws with it. It was just a trend. You can probably think of a lot of trends that come and go, come and go. What makes a movement take hold? And what makes a movement become a movement? I have a list here of a bunch of different movements that have really taken root and really succeeded for a number of years and really made changes in many ways. And I have a list of some movements from Morocco that you might know, and I'm sure I'm just getting a very small part of this. So that gives you a pretty good idea of what you will be doing in this class. I want you to come to the class with, excuse me, a few things in mind. Number one, I want you to have other movements from Morocco. I don't really want to talk a great deal about movements in America. They're what I've studied, but they're of only minimal use to you. You should know about them and know of them, and we'll talk about what made them work, but I want you to have your movements in mind. What's going on? And I understand there are dozens in Morocco. Around the world, we are facing a decade of uprising, I believe, thanks to COVID, thanks to right-wing nationalism. Trump and other leaders are trying to shut down protest, and it's, of course, when you do that, get ready. So I want you to come with other movements in mind. I want you to come having read the Malcolm Gladwell New Yorker article that I sent you, or that ITD sent you, called Small Change. And I want you to be ready to take your movements forward. I look forward to seeing you on screen, and wishing again that I were in Morocco. And I wish you all a good day and to stay safe. Thank you very much.